Morning, and we talked about this when it happened, and we're going to get some expert opinion on this in regards to how this is going to affect Mississippi moving forward, talking about the undercount on the census that we suffered through. And we have to talk about it, someone who knows exactly what kind of impact we could expect from this. She's the director of the University of Mississippi Center for Population Studies and the State Data Center of Mississippi, and the co-director of University of Mississippi's Community First Research Center for Wellbeing and Creative Achievement. Dr. Ann Kafer joins us. How are you this morning, Doc?
Good. Thank you so much.
That's a heck of an introduction. Do you ever take a nap?
No, there are no naps, and I often don't actually use all those titles.
Okay. Well, you're stuck with all of them now because you've been introduced with them. When this came out, and I noticed when the story first broke, it didn't seem like it was getting the attention I thought it should have gotten. I was here and I was talking about it that day, going, "This is a huge deal, and we're not really talking about this like we should." Let's just run through first. This is not unusual to have undercounts and overcounts on a census, is it?
Correct. Yeah, we've had undercounts and overcounts nearly every year of the census.
That's just the nature of the beast. That's the way it works. But it's not as simple as just doing a head count and moving on. There's money involved in this that's tied directly to your population numbers. So a significant undercount, is this going to cost us money?
Yeah, it's going to cost about $250 million. And those are rough estimates. We don't actually know what the impact will be. And it can be on everything from summer feeding programs, school feeding programs, community development programs, disaster relief. So it runs the gamut of what we're going to lose money on.
And let me just say this right up front, and we can circle back around to it. There's nothing we can do about this. Even though we have gotten these numbers from the Census Bureau, the actual census count is the census count. It's not adjustable, is it?
Exactly. Yeah. That will be the struggle, right? So the numbers we received from the census, those are what we have for apportionment, and our numbers are our numbers. There's no shifting, there's no recounting in that way. There are some mechanisms that we can talk about for municipal governments, counties, even the state, to have a review. But those are process reviews. They're not actually recounting. And to do an actual recount is extremely costly.
Yeah, well, I would think so. It was a big deal to do the count to begin with, and doing a recount, well, it's not provided for us, so it's a moot point to even talk about it. It's not something that we can really go through. So there's no way to fix this. I think we had, the third largest undercount of all the states in America?
We did, right after Arkansas and Tennessee. Yeah, and most of the undercounts occurred in the southern region, and that's for lots of reasons. We know that folks that tend to get undercounted are rural folks. The South is fairly rural. Racial and ethnic minorities, and we have some of the most diverse states in the nation. And so, it's something that we'll have to manage and mitigate moving forward.
Well, exactly, because this change, 4%, doesn't sound like a lot. But in our particular case, it's the difference between the numbers that we have, which shows a very, very slight decline in population, when in fact our population actually increased from the last census, right?
Yes, yeah. And that's one of the things that's fairly alarming. As someone who saw the initial census numbers, the worry is always that you're going to lose congressional voice, right? And if those are apportionment numbers, that's something that we as a state, we really need to, for the next census, make sure that we're on our game.
Now, if taking this out beforehand, we had talked about it in the census, we worked hard, everybody put a lot of effort into it. We thought we did a good job. What kind of letter grade would we assign to the census now, knowing how much of an undercount it was? And is there anything we can do to avoid that in 10 years?
Oh, absolutely. So I think it's a mix of factors, right? This is the first time that the census moved to an online format. And I think one of the things is education, right? Making sure that folks understand that process. The other thing is broadband, right? As a state, 70%, 77% of our population has access to broadband. So we're missing a whole swath of folks. So that's something that we can work on in the next 10 years. The other thing is starting a bit earlier in our census awareness, and that's something that our office is going to be working on over the next 10 years, is making sure that local governments, making sure that folks who are answering the census or engaged in our programming understand that process and know how important it is. But also, we rely on the feds not to end enumeration early.
Well, that's a very good point. And this one, I think, was also probably a bit different than normal because of the pandemic. Because in the middle of the first global pandemic in 100 years, in a century, we have a census. That was just bad luck and bad timing, I think. And I would think that probably had an impact on the count.
Oh, absolutely, because that affects enumeration, right? This is the first time that the census relied so heavily on essentially vital records, right? Administrative records. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the pandemic.
Now, you mentioned, you talked about various areas where this could impact us financially and will impact us financially, because you don't just look at the difference between our census count now and the census count from 10 years ago. You look at the difference between the census count we have to go by and what it should have been, according to what they're telling us now, which is a much bigger difference. That translates into dollars, as you said, about $250 million. Let's say, and I am not asking for this, I almost hate to mention it because I don't want to jinx us, if we have a hurricane come in and we have a federal disaster area declared, does this affect how much assistance we get?
It can, yeah, because they'll base those on the estimated population that's impacted. And so it's going to require a lot of advocacy at the federal level.
Well, that brings me to my next question. We can't change the count. We can't change the results of the census. But moving forward, can we explain this to people? Because, again, and I want to make sure that everybody understands, when we're talking about that it came out that we were undercounted, this wasn't some separate group that came out and said that. That data comes from the Census Bureau, right, that we were undercounted.
Yes. Yeah.
So these are official numbers.
Survey.
Yeah, these are official numbers.
Yes, absolutely. So what they do is they take a survey of folks and they sort of match the survey of folks post-census enumeration, and then they match it with their census record and sort of see who's missed. So we don't have a lot of detail about the kind of folks who are missed, just about their geographic location. One thing that our office is going to be doing, and we're working with some other states, because as you mentioned, Tennessee is also sort of navigating this new territory, because these were fairly large undercounts when you compare them to previous years, is we're going to have to get really good and work on our methodologies for population projections. So that's something our office is doing, because the path forward really involves getting better data and better estimates in the hands of local leaders and local decision makers. And so helping them understand what they're now going to have to navigate with fewer resources. And so that's what our office is working on right now.
But on the other hand, you mentioned advocacy, and my question is, our folks in Washington, our representatives, our senators, all of our folks up there, is there anything they can do to explain this and say, hey, but look at this. We really need a little more help than what the official numbers are going to give, or is that even possible?
That's well above my pay grade. I would hope that it's possible. I hope that they have the ability to sort of have that conversation with their fellow reps and their fellow senators, just as an understanding, right? Because we can also look at who got overcounted, mostly in the Northeast, right? And so if we talk about redistribution of those resources,
I have a feeling it's going to be harder to get the overcounted people to give up money than it would be for us to try to ask for more. I have a feeling that's a different conversation and probably a shorter one, but we'll see how that works out. Can you hang on through the break for just a minute?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Ann Kafer with us talking about the undercount on the census of Mississippians and how it's going to impact us. As usual, it means money, and we'll talk more about it when we return here on The Gallo Show, live in the Trustmark Bank Studios on Super Talk, Mississippi. Welcome back, Super Talk, Mississippi, The Gallo Show. Live in the Trustmark Bank Studios, Dave Hughes here, and still linked in with us both on Super Talk TV and on your local station, Dr. Ann Kafer, who has a lot of titles she apparently doesn't use, and I don't know which are which, so I'm just going to say Dr. Ann Kafer and get back into it.
Just move on.
Yeah, well, it's not that long of a segment, and she's got like 8 of them. I mean, so, we have to pace ourselves here. We were talking about the census and the financial impact that it's going to have moving forward, and you were talking about getting information to the localities. Is that more so they know what to expect in terms of how much less money they're going to get in the future, or is it so that maybe they can figure out a way to fight this a little bit? Not that there's really any way to do that, I don't think.
Well, it's not so much so that they can fight it. Really, what we're going to be working on is helping them understand what their actual numbers in terms of strategic planning are going to be. So as they begin to plan for these financial shortfalls, how can they make the best decisions on allocating resources effectively? And they can do that better if they have better data. And that's what our office does.
Well, and that makes perfect sense. That's something that I think sometimes we forget to do in some areas, which is to manage from the data. And a lot of times it can tell you what's coming. And in this case, it most certainly will. Now, you said 250 million. I assume that's over the 10 years until the next census, right? Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
So about 25 million a year. Do we have any idea, and I'm pretty sure we don't, but I'm going to ask anyway because you've got a lot of titles, so you might know. Is there any way to figure out, is any particular part of the state going to be more impacted than any other part from this? Because you said that there are regional differences in terms of the undercount versus the count that was supposed to happen. Do we have any idea what parts of the state might see a bigger financial punch from this?
We don't. We don't have a good sense of the region. But what we do know is that folks who often rely on federal programs in terms of support, whether that's community development, whether that's summer feeding programs, those are going to be Mississippi's most vulnerable. And they're going to feel this fairly acutely because those services and programs are going to be harder to access.
Now, let me ask you this, because I saw something. One thing we apparently do have some data on is the age groups and how they were overcounted or undercounted, and there are some pretty distinct differences there in the various age groups.
There are. So what we're noticing is that younger folks are being undercounted, which we expected, and older folks are being overcounted. Again, they're maybe a bit more responsive to when folks knock on their door. We're not sure. But what that also means is that we have sort of this false sense of aging in place. And while that is sort of a global trend, it's not unique to Mississippi. It's certainly not unique to the U.S. It is something to think about and as a state be strategically planning for.
Here's my question. I've seen a couple of people on the C Spire text line that have asked something along these lines, but let's just get to the underlying problem. How do you have an overcount? If you got 100 people and you come up with 106, how does that happen? Is somebody answering the door twice? How's that work?
So sometimes what can happen is you have someone who's maybe answered it online and then they've also been enumerated and it didn't get caught. But what the census is very clear is that they don't actually understand the mechanisms for this, but my read of the data is that's probably the most likely cause.
That makes sense. You got literally counted twice, some people, because they were super eager to make sure they were in, and just to make sure I'll do it online too, or the other way around. And there's not really much way to fix that in terms of people doing it. I think we just have to get better at catching it. Is there any way for us to improve the way we do this so that we can eliminate some of these undercounts and overcounts that we go through? Like I said, it seems pretty simple. If you got 100 people, you should come up with something close to 100, I would think, when you count them.
Yes. So I think one of the things that we can work on as a state, but federally, and that's part of our job, is really educating folks when they're answering the census. You only need to do this one time. And if you have an enumerator that shows up and wants to count you again, let them know that you've already done this online. And that, I think that helps with the overcount. Undercount it's really about getting to folks. Mississippi is a pretty rural state, a fairly remote state. And some of those folks don't like to be found, but helping them understand really that participation in this is not, we're not tracking. It's not, this is about making sure that everyone in the state gets counted so we get the resources that we need.
Well, and I know some people who were like, no, I'm not replying to the census. They're tracking you. They're just trying to, I'm not going to participate in this. Well, then you don't get to complain about the state of the roads. You don't get to complain about the state of the benefits coming in from the federal government when we have a hurricane coming through, because it's all tied together. That's part of it. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, no, exactly. Everyone has to participate so that everyone gets the benefits.
Exactly. So just remember this. Nobody's going to remember this for 10 years, and we're going to have to talk to you again in about 8 or 9 years and go over this again. But we're still going to keep talking about it for the next decade, probably every single time we have something pop up and we have the money come in from Washington, and it's not as much as we need, which is the real problem that we're trying to deal with here. And unfortunately, not a lot we can do about it except know what's coming and budget appropriately, right?
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of it's going to come down to strategic planning and using data. And we're going to incorporate that undercount into our calculations so that local governments have a better sense of what they're going to have to navigate over the next 10 years.
Just out of curiosity, while you're doing all these numbers and calculations, are you also going to run it with the correct number just as a basis of comparison to see what the difference would have been?
Yes. So that's actually something that's really interesting from a research standpoint, right? Like most people are like,
Right.
you don't need to nerd out on data. But that for us, that's something that's really interesting, right? Is like, where are the likely over and undercounts happening and that helps us plan for the next census, right? If we can figure out where some of these gaps existed, those are places that we can do extra outreach and provide extra support to.
That makes sense. And that's why I was asking, because it would be fascinating to see exactly what the difference is going to be moving forward. Because a lot of times you can say you were overcounted or undercounted, and I believe it's over 100,000 people that this made the difference of in the population of the state, right?
Yes,
That sounds impressive, but it gets more people's attention when you can put a dollar figure on that.
Well, absolutely it does.
So that's what you guys are doing, and I assume that you probably have a headache from all the math sometimes, don't you?
Well, that's why we're hiring another person to help with some of that math. We have a whole position that's going to be dedicated just to this, knowing that this is going to be a bit of an issue moving forward over the next 10 years. And, our office is tasked with outreach and the population projections for this state. And we're responsible to all of the stakeholders in the state. So anytime that they have questions, they need help or assistance, they just need to come to our office. And we're ramping up staff so that we can be supportive for them.
And they can just, how do they reach you? If a local, a municipal government, a county government, anybody wants to get a hold of you and find out some data, how do they do that?
So they can email me directly, or they can email our CPS email. So it's super easy, amkafer@olemiss.edu or cps@olemiss.edu. And we will make sure that whatever questions they have or needs they have, we can address.
And I want to make sure, in case you're not watching Super Talk TV, because it is up there on the little chyron underneath your picture, that's Kafer with a C, not a K, when you're spelling out the email. Because I know how it works. Some people will hear that and they'll spell it with a K, which would make sense, but it's with a C. So send her an email, and they will help you out as soon as they get the new person trained.
Yes,
They'll
we'll have
help
that
you
person
out
onboarded
now.
by the end of the summer.
Oh,
By the end of the
fantastic.
summer, that's our goal. Yeah.
Fantastic. What?
Yeah.
I'm just writing her a note right as we speak.
Okay. So Perez is jotting notes down. He's taking notes over there. That's good. There will be a quiz later. Dr. Ann Kafer, we appreciate your time.
Is it a
so
pop
much.
quiz?
Oh, it's the only kind we do here. We appreciate your time so much, and keep us updated as you go through this process and you get more numbers. I'm really curious to see that, and I think the figure I saw was about 110,000. Is the difference between what was counted and what should have been counted. I'm really curious to see, dollar-wise, what that amounts to that we're going to be missing out on for the next decade because of the undercount in the census. That's a fascinating number for me to find out. So appreciate the work you're doing. Keep up the good work and keep us up to date on what you find out, okay?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and always feel free to reach out.
Fantastic. Dr. Ann Kafer.